May 14, 1943. Attu Island, Alaska. The fog clung to the volcanic rock like a shroud. In the pre-dawn cold, where the wind carried salt and the bitter smell of gunpowder, Sergeant Toshio Yamada pressed his body flat against the tundra. His uniform, once crisp and proud, was now torn and stained with mud the color of old blood. His rifle, empty for 2 days, lay beside him, a useless piece of iron. Around him, the silence was punctuated only by the distant rumble of American artillery and the ragged breathing of the few men who remained. They had been told that surrender was a disgrace worse than death. They had been told that the enemy would torture them, mutilate them, parade their broken bodies as trophies of a savage war. Yamada's stomach clenched, not from fear alone but from a hunger so profound it had become a constant companion. He closed his eyes and thought of rice, white rice, the simple taste of home. When the American soldiers appeared through the mist tall, bundled in heavy coats, their faces obscured by the fog. Yamada did not raise his hands immediately. He watched them, expecting the crack of a rifle, the flash of a bayonet. Instead, one of the soldiers knelt beside him, said something in a language Yamada could not understand, and offered him a canteen. Water, clean water. Yamada hesitated, his mind racing through the propaganda films he had seen, the speeches he had memorized. But his body betrayed him. His hand reached out, trembling, and he drank. This moment, small, almost invisible in the vast machinery of the Second World War, would become the first fracture in a carefully constructed worldview. For Sergeant Yamada and tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war who would follow him into American captivity, the next months and years would not unfold as they had been taught to expect. They would not face the executioner's blade or the torturer's hand. Instead, they would encounter something far more disorienting, an enemy who fed them, educated them, and healed their wounds. An enemy who, in defying every expectation, would quietly dismantle the ideology that had sent them to war in the first place. To understand the shock that awaited Japanese prisoners in American hands, one must first understand the world they came from. In the 1930s, as Japan's military expanded across Asia, the Imperial Japanese Army cultivated a warrior ethos rooted in ancient samurai codes and modern totalitarian propaganda. The concept of gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, elevated death in battle to the highest honor. Surrender, by contrast, was branded as the ultimate betrayal. The Senjinkun, or military field code, issued in 1941, explicitly commanded soldiers, "Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your reputation." This was not mere rhetoric. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated from childhood in schools, through films, and in military training camps where the message was hammered home with relentless precision. To be captured was to become horyo, a prisoner, a word that carried with it the weight of eternal disgrace. Families of captured soldiers were told their sons or husbands had died honorably, even when they had not. The shame was so profound that many Japanese soldiers chose suicide over surrender, even when wounded, starving, and surrounded. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, entire units would charge headlong into American machine guns in desperate, final banzai attacks. Civilians, too, leapt from cliffs rather than face what they believed would be the unspeakable horrors of American captivity. This fear was not irrational within the framework they had been given. Japanese propaganda painted Americans as barbaric, racist demons who would rape, torture, and murder prisoners without mercy. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions warned of mutilation and cannibalism. Films shown to soldiers depicted American troops as subhuman monsters. And there was a grim logic to this fear. The Japanese military's own treatment of enemy prisoners was catastrophic. Allied POWs in Japanese hands faced starvation rations, forced labor, medical neglect, and routine executions. The Bataan Death March, the construction of the Burma Railway, the massacres at Wake Island and elsewhere. These were not aberrations but reflections of a military culture that viewed surrender as contemptible and prisoners as less than human. If this was how Japan treated its captives, the soldiers reasoned, surely the Americans would do the same, or worse. So when the first Japanese soldiers were captured in significant numbers after the grinding battles of Guadalcanal, Attu, Tarawa, they arrived in American hands expecting to die. Some closed their eyes and waited for the bullet. Others feigned injury or madness, hoping for a quicker end. What they did not expect was to be loaded onto trucks, driven to field hospitals, and given medical care. What they did not expect was to be handed food, hot food, abundant food, food that seemed impossible in a world defined by scarcity. The first meal was always the same, not in content, but in effect. For many Japanese POWs, the moment they sat before a tray of American military rations became the moment the carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Corporal Hiroshi Funasaka, captured on Bougainville in early 1944, would later describe the experience in his memoir with a mixture of disbelief and something close to reverence. He had not eaten a full meal in 11 days. His body, racked with dysentery and malaria, had shrunk to a gaunt shadow. When American medics brought him to a field hospital and placed before him a tray of beef stew, white bread, canned peaches, and coffee, he stared at it as though it were a hallucination. The stew was thick with chunks of meat. The bread was soft, almost sweet. The peaches floated in syrup so rich it made his throat tighten. He ate slowly at first, afraid it might be poisoned or a cruel joke. But the food was real, and there was more. Always, there was more. This abundance was not an accident, it was policy. The United States military, bound by the Geneva Convention and driven by a combination of legal obligation, strategic calculation, and democratic principle, treated prisoners of war according to standards that often exceeded those of its own frontline troops in the field. Japanese POWs in American camps received 3 meals a day, totaling approximately 3,200 calories, more than many American civilians consumed during wartime rationing. The meals included meat, vegetables, rice or bread, fruit, and even occasional luxuries like chocolate or ice cream. Medical care was administered by trained doctors and nurses. Sick and wounded prisoners were treated in the same hospitals as American soldiers, often in adjacent wards. Men who arrived emaciated, diseased, and near death were nursed back to health with a care that seemed, to them, incomprehensible. For Sergeant Yamada, now interned at a POW camp in California, the meals became a daily ritual of cognitive dissonance. Each morning he would join the line in the mess hall. Clean, orderly, supervised by American guards who carried rifles but rarely used them, and receive his tray. Eggs, bacon, toast with butter, coffee with sugar and milk. He ate in silence, surrounded by other prisoners whose faces reflected the same confusion, the same unspoken question: why? Why would an enemy feed its captives so well? In the Imperial Japanese Army, rations for frontline soldiers had dwindled to a few hundred grams of rice per day, supplemented by whatever could be scavenged from the jungle or the sea. Officers hoarded supplies while enlisted men starved. Disease and malnutrition killed more Japanese soldiers than American bullets. And yet here, in the land of the enemy, food was plentiful. Inexplicably, impossibly plentiful. The rice became a symbol. Not the thin gruel or weevil-infested grain they had known in the Pacific, but white rice, properly cooked, served in portions that seemed lavish. The American camp commanders, aware of Japanese dietary preferences, made efforts to include rice in the meals. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but to the prisoners it was profound. Rice was home. Rice was identity. To be given rice by the enemy was to be acknowledged as human. The camps themselves defied expectation. The largest and most well-documented facilities, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Camp Livingston in Louisiana, were not the hell pits of propaganda. They were orderly, functional, and strangely mundane, rows of wooden barracks, each heated in winter and ventilated in summer, latrines with running water, infirmaries stocked with medicine, recreation yards where prisoners could play baseball, a game many had never seen before but learned quickly under the guidance of Japanese-American interpreters who served as cultural liaisons. The interpreters, Nisei soldiers who had volunteered for military service even as their own families were interned in camps within the United States, occupied a strange and painful position. Many had been born in America, spoke English as their first language, and had never seen Japan. Yet they were tasked with bridging the gap between two worlds, translating not just words, but entire systems of meaning. They explained to bewildered prisoners that the Geneva Convention guaranteed humane treatment. They explained that the Red Cross inspected the camps regularly. They explained that the United States, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated under a set of legal and moral principles that did not permit the torture or execution of prisoners. To many Japanese POWs, these explanations seemed absurd, even insulting. How could an enemy at war extend such courtesies? It had to be a trick, a ruse designed to extract information or weaken resolve. But weeks became months, and the trick did not end. The food kept coming, the medicine kept coming, and then came the classes. Education programs in American POW camps were born from a combination of humanitarian impulse and strategic foresight. U.S. military planners understood that Japan, unlike Germany, was a nation unlikely to surrender quickly or completely. The war in the Pacific was a grinding, island-by-island campaign that produced relatively few prisoners compared to the European theater. Those who were captured, however, represented a unique opportunity. If they could be re-educated, if their perception of America and democracy could be reshaped, they might become ambassadors for a different kind of post-war order. And so, beginning in 1944, American authorities implemented a program of voluntary education and ideological reorientation in the POW camps. The classes were not mandatory, at least not officially. Prisoners could choose to attend lectures on American history, government, economics, and culture. They could learn English. They could watch films, not propaganda exactly, but carefully selected documentaries and Hollywood features that portrayed American life in a favorable light. Mr. B. Smith Goes to Washington. The Grapes of Wrath. Newsreels showing factories, farms, cities teeming with cars and commerce. To Japanese soldiers raised on images of America as a nation of lazy, decadent weaklings, the films were a revelation. The scale of American industry, the wealth of its cities, the sheer abundance of goods, these were not weaknesses but strengths. And the political system, with its elections and debates and free press, was not chaos, but a kind of organized freedom that many prisoners had never imagined possible. Corporal Kenji Tsutsui, interned at Camp Clarinda, attended an English class taught by a retired schoolteacher from Iowa who volunteered her time. She was elderly, patient, and utterly bewildered by the idea that these young men, polite, eager, often shy, had been told she and her countrymen were monsters. She taught them vocabulary, freedom, liberty, vote, justice. She taught them songs, Home on the Range, America the Beautiful. She brought in her grandchildren once, two blonde girls in braids who giggled and handed out cookies. Tsutsui, who had been taught that Americans hated all Asians, watched the children with a confusion so deep it bordered on grief. If these were the enemy, what had he been fighting for? The medical care was perhaps the most powerful solvent of propaganda. Japanese soldiers arrived in American hands suffering from wounds, diseases, and malnutrition that would have been death sentences in their own military system. Malaria, dysentery, tropical ulcers that ate through muscle and bone, gangrene, beriberi, men who could barely walk, barely see, barely breathe. In Japanese field hospitals, such men were often left to die or given minimal treatment so that scarce resources could be allocated to soldiers who still had a chance to fight. But in American hospitals, every prisoner was treated as though he mattered. Private Shigeru Takahashi had been shot through the abdomen during the battle for Peleliu. He should have died within hours. Instead, American medics stabilized him, loaded him onto a hospital ship, and transported him to a naval hospital in San Diego. There, surgeons operated on him not once, but twice, removing shrapnel, repairing damaged organs, stitching him back together with a care that seemed absurd. Why waste such effort on an enemy soldier? Takahashi lay in his hospital bed, surrounded by other wounded men, some American, some Japanese, and listened to the hum of machines, the soft voices of nurses, the distant clatter of meal trays. He was given morphine for the pain. He was given blood transfusions. He was given clean sheets that were changed daily. When he developed an infection, he was given penicillin, a new miracle drug that had only recently become available. He lived. Recovery was slow, painful, and punctuated by long hours of reflection. Takahashi had been taught that to survive as a prisoner was shameful. But lying in that hospital bed, alive because of American medicine, American resources, American mercy, he began to question what he had been taught. If his own country had captured an American soldier in the same condition, would they have saved him? He knew the answer. He had seen the answer in New Guinea, in the Philippines, in a dozen nameless islands where wounded Allied prisoners were bayoneted or left to die in the sun. The contrast was inescapable. By the end of the war, over 5,000 Japanese POWs had been held in camps across the United States. Thousands more were held in Australia, New Zealand, and other Allied territories. The mortality rate among Japanese prisoners in American custody was extraordinarily low, less than 2%, a figure that included deaths from wounds sustained before capture. Compare this to the mortality rate of Allied POWs in Japanese hands, approximately 27%, a staggering loss driven by starvation, disease, execution, and systemic neglect. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could obscure. But not all prisoners were transformed. Some clung to the old beliefs, refusing to eat, refusing to cooperate, waiting for rescue or death. In the early months of the war, when the first Japanese POWs arrived in American camps, resistance was fierce. Some attempted suicide. Others refused to give any information beyond name and rank, convinced that torture was imminent. Camp authorities, following Geneva Convention protocols, did not force compliance. They did not beat confessions out of prisoners or threaten them with execution. Instead, they waited. They provided food. They provided medical care. They provided, in other words, a kind of patience that was itself a form of psychological warfare. Over time, the resistance crumbled, not all at once, but gradually, like a dam eroded by slow water. The food was real. The medicine was real. The absence of torture was real. And as prisoners recovered their health, as they attended classes and watched films and spoke with interpreters, a new narrative began to form. Perhaps, some whispered, they had been lied to. Perhaps the enemy was not what they had been told. Perhaps the war itself had been built on falsehoods. This realization was not universal, but it was widespread enough to alarm Japanese military intelligence. Reports filtered back through clandestine channels and interrogations of repatriated prisoners after the war. Some former POWs spoke of the American camps with a mixture of shame and wonder. They described the food, the medical care, the education programs. They described being treated, against all expectation, with dignity. For a military culture built on the dehumanization of the enemy and the glorification of death, these reports were a strategic disaster. They undermined the core narrative that had sustained Japan's war effort. If the Americans were not monsters, if surrender did not mean torture and death, then what was the point of gyokusai? What was the point of dying? The symbol that many prisoners carried with them, long after the war ended, was not a weapon or a flag, but something far more mundane, the tin can. American military rations came in cans, cans of meat, cans of fruit, cans of vegetables. To Japanese soldiers accustomed to bamboo containers and cloth sacks, the sheer ubiquity of canned goods was astonishing. The cans were everywhere, stacked in warehouses, distributed at meals, discarded in piles that seemed wasteful in their abundance. Some prisoners began collecting the empty cans, marveling at the printing, the labels, the standardized shapes. Here was industrial efficiency made tangible. Here was the proof that America could produce not just guns and tanks, but food. Vast quantities of food, packaged and preserved and shipped across oceans to feed millions of soldiers and prisoners alike. Corporal Funasaka, now interned at Camp McCoy, held a can of peaches one afternoon and turned it over in his hands. The label showed a sun-drenched orchard, ripe fruit hanging from trees, a vision of pastoral plenty. He thought of Japan, where food shortages had become endemic, where civilians subsisted on rationed rice and sweet potatoes, where soldiers in the field ate grass and tree bark. He thought of the propaganda that had promised Japanese superiority, Japanese destiny, the inevitable victory of the samurai spirit over Western decadence. And he thought of this stupid, ordinary can of peaches, and realized it was a better argument for American power than any speech or film. It was proof of a system that worked, a society that could sustain itself, an economy that produced surplus rather than scarcity. It was, in its own way, an ideological weapon far more potent than a bomb. As 1945 dragged on and Japan's position grew increasingly desperate, the number of prisoners began to rise. The fall of Iwo Jima, the invasion of Okinawa, the relentless bombing campaigns, each brought a new wave of captured soldiers, many of them conscripts, barely trained teenagers who had been thrown into battle with little preparation and less hope. These young men arrived in American camps starving, traumatized, and utterly bewildered. They had been told that surrender meant death, but here they were, alive and fed and sitting in classrooms learning English. One such prisoner, a 19-year-old named Hiroshi Matsumoto, had been drafted in late 1944 and sent to Okinawa with less than 3 months of training. He had fired his rifle twice before he was captured, hiding in a cave with a dozen other soldiers, all of them convinced that the Americans would throw in grenades or flamethrowers and end it. Instead, an interpreter called into the cave in Japanese, promising food and safety. Matsumoto did not believe it, but he was too tired and too hungry to resist. He crawled out into the daylight, hands raised, and was given water and a chocolate bar. The chocolate was the first sweet thing he had tasted in months. He ate it slowly, savoring the richness, and wept. At Camp Livingston, Matsumoto attended a lecture on democracy. The instructor, a U.S. Army lieutenant who had studied in Japan before the war, explained the concept of government by consent, the idea that leaders were chosen by the people rather than imposed by divine right or military force. Matsumoto listened, skeptical but curious. In Japan, he had been taught that the emperor was a living god, that loyalty to the state was absolute, that individual desires were subordinate to collective duty. But here was a different model, one in which the individual had value, voice, agency. It was a strange and unsettling idea, but it lodged in his mind like a seed. Not everyone was receptive. Some prisoners, particularly older career soldiers and officers, rejected the education programs outright. They saw them as insidious attempts at brainwashing, an assault on Japanese identity. They organized quietly, enforcing discipline among the younger prisoners, discouraging cooperation with the Americans. In some camps, internal conflicts erupted between die-hard loyalists and those who had begun to question the old ideology. Fistfights broke out. Threats were made. Camp authorities, aware of the tensions, separated the factions when possible, but the divisions ran deep. Even in captivity, the battle for minds continued. When the war ended in August 1945, the news reached the POW camps in waves of confusion and disbelief. The atomic bombs, the Soviet declaration of war, the emperor's radio address, his voice thin and otherworldly announcing the unthinkable, surrender. For many prisoners, the announcement was devastating. Everything they had been told, everything they had believed had proven false. Japan had not triumphed. The samurai spirit had not been enough. The divine wind had not saved them. They were prisoners of war, and now their country, too, was a prisoner. The months that followed were a strange interlude. Repatriation was a slow process, complicated by logistics and politics. Some prisoners remained in American camps until 1946, working on farms or in factories as part of labor programs, earning small wages and sending letters home to families who had thought them dead. Others were transferred to camps in Japan itself, where they awaited processing and returned to civilian life. The return was not easy. In a society that had glorified death over surrender, returning POWs faced stigma and suspicion. Some lied about their experiences, claiming they had been liberated from forced labor camps rather than admitting they had been treated well. Others spoke openly, describing the food, the medical care, the education programs, and were met with skepticism or outright hostility. How could the enemy have been so humane? It sounded like propaganda. But the truth was recorded in documents, photographs, and the testimony of thousands of men. The International Red Cross, which inspected American POW camps throughout the war, filed reports noting the generally high standard of care. Allied authorities documented the programs and policies. And the prisoners themselves, in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews, confirmed what had seemed impossible, that an enemy at war had chosen to treat its captives not as subhuman refuse, but as human beings entitled to dignity, care, and even education. Sergeant Toshio Yamada returned to Japan in early 1946. He had spent nearly 3 years in American captivity, first in Alaska, then in California. He had learned English. He had attended classes on American history and government. He had worked on a farm in the Central Valley, harvesting vegetables alongside other prisoners, earning $1 a day that he saved in a small cloth pouch. He had eaten more food in those 3 years than he had in the previous 5. He had received dental care, medical treatment for chronic malaria, even a pair of eyeglasses to correct vision problems he had ignored for years. When he stepped off the repatriation ship in Yokohama, he carried with him a duffel bag containing his few possessions, a change of clothes, a Japanese English dictionary, a photograph of the farm where he had worked, and a single tin can empty, the label long since faded. He kept the can as a reminder. In the ruins of post-war Japan, Yamada struggled to reintegrate. His family had been told he died on Attu. His return was met with confusion and, in some quarters, shame. He did not speak much about his time in captivity, not because he was forbidden, though stigma made it difficult, but because he did not know how to explain it. How could he describe the strange generosity of the enemy? How could he convey the dissonance of being fed and healed and educated by the very people he had been taught to hate? He took a job as a clerk, married, had children, and lived quietly. But he never forgot the meals, the classes, the hospital bed where American doctors had saved his life. And he never discarded the tin can. The experience of Japanese POWs in American camps stands as one of the war's quiet paradoxes. It was not a story of heroic liberation or dramatic rescue, but of something subtler and perhaps more powerful, the slow erosion of ideology through the persistent application of humane treatment. The United States, for all its flaws, its own internment of Japanese Americans, its racial segregation, its capacity for violence operated in its handling of enemy prisoners according to a set of principles that acknowledged the humanity of the other. This was not purely altruism. It was strategy, law, culture, and pragmatism intertwined, but its effect was undeniable. For the prisoners, the transformation was not instant or universal. Some left the camps as convinced of Japanese superiority as when they arrived. Others left confused, their worldview shattered but not yet rebuilt. But many carried with them a new understanding, a recognition that the enemy they had been taught to fear was not a monolith of evil, but a society capable of both great cruelty and great compassion. They had seen American abundance not as decadence, but as the fruit of a different kind of order. They had tasted freedom, not in the abstract, but in the simple dignity of being treated as a person rather than a number. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and redefined itself, the stories of former POWs remained largely unspoken, tucked away in the private memories of men who had returned from the dead. But the lessons lingered. The generation that had fought the war would give rise to a generation that questioned it. The absolute certainties of militarism gave way, slowly and unevenly, to a society that valued peace, prosperity, and individual rights. The transformation of Japan from imperial power to democratic ally was shaped by many forces: occupation policies, economic aid, cultural exchange. But among them, quietly and persistently, were the memories of men who had once been prisoners and had learned. against all expectation that the enemy could be kind. There is a photograph, preserved in the National Archives, taken at Camp McCoy in the summer of 1945. It shows a group of Japanese prisoners gathered in a recreation yard, playing baseball. They are dressed in standard-issue fatigues, their faces relaxed, almost smiling. An American guard stands in the background, watching but not interfering. The sun is bright. The grass is green. It is an unremarkable scene, domestic and peaceful, the kind of image that might have been taken at any small-town game in America. But it is also a profound disruption of everything those prisoners had been taught to believe about war, about the enemy, about themselves. One of the players in that photograph is Sergeant Yamada. He stands near third base, glove raised, ready. He had never played baseball before his capture. The rules had seemed absurd at first: hit a ball, run in a circle, return to where you started. What was the point? But he learned, and found in the game a strange kind of joy, a momentary escape from memory and grief. In that photograph, frozen in the amber of history, he is neither victorious nor defeated. He is simply alive, part of a moment that should not have been possible but was. The tin can, the white rice, the hospital bed, the classroom, the baseball game. These were not the instruments of conquest, but of a subtler victory. They did not force surrender. They made surrender survivable. They did not impose ideology, they offered an alternative. They did not punish the enemy, they demonstrated through action rather than words the possibility of a world ordered differently. For soldiers who had been taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, the discovery that life continued beyond capture and continued with dignity was a revelation that no amount of battlefield prowess could have achieved. In the end, the story of Japanese POWs in American camps is not a story of triumph or tragedy, but of transformation. It is a story of men who expected to die and learned to live. It is a story of an enemy who chose, imperfectly and incompletely but persistently, to recognize the humanity of those it had defeated. And it is a reminder that war is fought not only with weapons, but with ideas, and that the most enduring victories are often the quietest ones. The meal served the wound healed. The truth revealed not through force, but through the stubborn, patient application of a principle, that every person, even in the midst of the most total war, retains a claim to dignity. Sergeant Yamada kept the tin can until his death in 1987. His children found it among his possessions, faded and dented, and did not understand its significance. They threw it away, as people do with objects that have outlived their context. But the truth it represented, the truth that abundance, compassion, and democracy were not weaknesses but strengths, survived. It survived in the testimonies of prisoners who returned home and rebuilt their lives. It survived in the policies of a post-war Japan that chose peace over militarism. It survived in the simple, stubborn fact that treating the enemy as human did not weaken the United States, but affirmed the very principles it claimed to fight for. War is often remembered for its violence, its destruction, its great battles and dramatic turns. But sometimes, in the quiet spaces between the headlines, another kind of story unfolds. A story of decency, of meals shared and wounds healed, of men who discovered that the enemy was not what they had been told. And in that discovery, against all expectation, they found not shame, but the possibility of redemption. The tin can, the rice, the hospital bed, these were the symbols of a war fought not only with guns, but with the persistent, quiet insistence that even in the darkest times humanity could prevail. For the prisoners who lived through it, the experience was not easily forgotten. It changed them, challenged them, and, in some cases, saved them. And in doing so, it offered a glimpse of a truth larger than any battlefield, that the greatest victories are not always won by force, but by the refusal to abandon the principles that define us, even and especially when facing those who would destroy us. In the end, the war ended. The prisoners went home, the camps were dismantled, the barracks torn down, the fields returned to farmers and families. But the memory remained, carried in the minds of men who had tasted both the bitterness of defeat and the unexpected sweetness of mercy. And in that memory, preserved like fruit in a tin can, was a lesson that transcended borders and generations, that even in the midst of total war, the choice to see the enemy as human was not weakness, but the ultimate expression of strength.